We're here to talk about cybersecurity in business. I have some anecdotal evidence of what we're about to talk about. I oversee our global cybersecurity team at Bloomberg News. We have been busy, very busy in the past year. Lots of cyber attacks, lots of data breaches, a splash of cyber espionage. And both of you are in a position to be able to speak on this from your perspective. I mean, let's start with you, Stephen. Sure. You have this vantage point. What is cybersecurity looking like on the ground floor at these manufacturing operations?
Well, there's a couple of really interesting trends, and we look at all manufacturing sectors in the UK. We are the national body for looking at manufacturing. And manufacturing in this country looks like about 800 large companies and 200,000 SMEs. That's what the manufacturing community looks like. And what we're seeing is a rush towards digitization. So there's a big trend about digitizing manufacturing at the moment. So we've got government programs encouraging those SMEs, those 200,000, to digitize. And we've also got a big labor and skill shortage, which is very similar to the US, actually. I was comparing notes with my US cousins in the same way. And the skill shortage in this country, and at the moment there's 64,000 vacancies in the manufacturing sector, are driving automation. So we've got digitization and automation going into these plants at some pace at the moment. The challenge is, on cybersecurity, we've traditionally looked at protecting the normal economic engine of a business. So payroll, finance and accounting. And cybersecurity companies are out there selling packages that do that every day of the week. A lot of these companies buy them. What is more challenging is what's going on in the factory itself with all the internet-connected devices and all the automation that's going in. There are millions of internet connections there, very often not covered by the security arrangements that the cybersecurity companies actually put into place. So on the OT side, on the operational technology side, we're seeing a real exposure and threat vectors there being created through maintenance networks with machines, through taking IP, through ransomware attacks. And that's growing very, very substantially. We can come on and talk about skills later, because that's quite important.
Yes.
So we're seeing these trends creating a lot of opportunity for cybersecurity.
That's one way to put it.
And that's the way of doing it. Yeah.
Paul, you have this this broader perspective to bring. Kyndryl serves a lot of the Fortune 500 companies. Is the manufacturing industry just bad at cybersecurity, or is this across the board? Like, how does it differ? What are the similarities?
Well, they're all have their challenges, but I will admit that according to our research, manufacturing is one of the worst.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
It is. With actually financial and healthcare really being some of the segments that probably do the best job of it. But I will say that the adoption of IoT is really creating new opportunities for threat actors out there that have not been seen before. And the proliferation, as part of Kyndryl, what we do is we in the manufacturing industry and other industries, we help customers adopt that technology and incorporate it and leverage it to drive operational efficiencies. And what we're seeing is that the introduction of all these IoT devices into the networks are really expanding the threat landscape, and that the attacks via IoT devices is up, just in the last year, is up 70% year over year. And the cost of a typical IoT attack, according to our research, is on average about $330,000 for a successful IoT attack, with the upper range being around $10 million of impact to an enterprise. Whenever
is that including the ransomware payments, or is that?
Well, they're the big ones, and we can talk about the big ones and some the big, $50, $100 million deals. But yeah, it's absolutely a growing threat, and part of the issue is just that while we've gotten our much better control and a handle on typical IT infrastructure, the IoT space is a new frontier. The operational technology integration really we're still struggling with, and cybersecurity, we're seeing that in cybersecurity threats.
So before we get to what are clearly much needed solutions, I'd like to know, what are the biggest mistakes that you're seeing enterprises make that are leading to these kinds of breaches? Stephen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So
what
on
are
the ground,
worst?
what are we seeing? So the first mistake is the way these things are looked at inside many businesses. And I would say, if you go back to the 800 large businesses, they tend to be on top of this. It's the smaller and medium enterprises that's got the real challenge. But very often, the guys looking after cybersecurity are in the IT department, or they're part of the IT infrastructure, and that's protecting the financial systems of the business. The guys installing IoT devices on the shop floor in automated production lines or robotics are production engineers. They're not in part of that. Very often the businesses are making the mistake of not bringing that together as part of the orbit. And then there's training, because what we see, many of those production engineers installing IoT devices are not trained on cybersecurity. They have no idea. We had a very interesting stat last year. We did a survey of the main suppliers of automation devices and IoT devices to the manufacturing sector in this country. And they did an audit of their devices and found that more than 90% were set to default passwords. Oh. And that's because the production engineers are not thinking about that. So the enlightened companies, the bigger ones, definitely on top of this, but that whole supply chain is where the focus needs to happen.
That is some really basic stuff. Paul, do you have other examples?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there are a lot of ways. I mean, but I agree 100% with Stephen. I mean, there's even like just one of the biggest hacks, you know, we've seen from going back to the Target days was just a password that employee had used in multiple the same password, and somebody was able to infiltrate with that, and you know, cost them 40 million in credit card exposures from that hack. But to go down another path that Stephen didn't touch on, another big mistake that we see people do is that they're not upgrading old technology, legacy technology. You know, we did an interesting survey of 3,200 CIOs in our company and looked at our own infrastructure that we manage for CIOs. And while 70% of CIOs feel like they got it under control, that they're modern technology, best in class, when you go in and you look at the infrastructure that they're managing, we're seeing 44% on average is out of life, end of service, which means that the underlying technology provider doesn't support that equipment anymore. That's a tremendous security exposure that a lot of companies have, and I think that as the regulation continues to evolve to focus more on infrastructure and not just information protection, but infrastructure protection, we're gonna see more regulatory policies coming out to drive that upgrading in enterprises.
So let's talk about solutions now that we've embarrassed all of the companies and the mistakes that they make. Stephen, what is the fix here? Is there a fix?
There's a few fixes here. There's about human behaviors very often. Most of this is around human behaviors. So training the staff properly, understanding where the cyber security risks are is vitally important. I think there's also a big role to play for the cybersecurity companies, because too many of them are just focused on the easy win and doing the front end and the financial systems, and are not really comprehensively understanding the OT environment and how that presents another whole threat vector which actually is not being protected. So I think there's a responsibility from the cybersecurity industry to help with this solution. And basically, as ever with these things, it's about leadership very often. So I can't tell you how many chief executives I've spoken to that say, hey, we've got a cybersecurity company, we've got CE+ certification, I've got everything in place, and then they get hit with a big cybersecurity breach because someone came in through the maintenance networks into their machine tools on the shop floor and stole their IP. And they're saying, how did that happen? So really, it's around understanding that does create a risk to your business. I think that's important.
Yeah, in our situation, though, in our view as we look at enterprises that we work with, what we find is that generally, 70 to 80% of enterprises have really good control policies in place. But to Stephen's point, it's not having the good policies in place, it's enforcing those policies and getting the humans to engage in it correctly. So that's where the big failures come. So even a company that's got great policy set up, 60, 70% of the time that there is a cybersecurity breach, it's because of some failure of a human to follow those guidelines and policies well. Yeah.
I am guilty of waiting until the last day of the deadline at Bloomberg to do my cybersecurity training every year. It's so long and it's very thorough, and so I'm like very appreciative of this. We are a tech company after all. But like for those who are not as lucky to go through an hour-long training every year, like what would the 3 things that you would put in a training be to the human beings at all of the companies?
Most of it is about your behavior inside the business. It's about not clicking on those phishing links and being able to identify them. It's about not plugging USB sticks into the thing on the shop floor that's got a USB port in it. It's the behaviors of people which account for most of the cybersecurity problems that we have.
Would you
Yeah,
add anything to that?
I agree with that. And it's also recognition with employees that, the social engineering concept is still a big percentage of attacks that happen out there. Educating employees about the fact that there are bad actors out there, that you may think that you work for a company that's not got anything interesting that somebody would want to steal, but that is not true. I mean, what we're seeing in particular between the state actors is that very surprising situations where they are, people are using social engineering, befriending people to find out, to get access into systems and companies that you would just not even imagine that there would be something valuable there.
Paul, for those who don't follow cybersecurity, social engineering is actually a tactic that has proliferated just in the past couple of years. Can you explain what social engineering is for those?
Well, social engineering is where a threat actor uses personal or information that they gain personally about an employee of a company to figure out a way to hack into a corporation's infrastructure. So that can take the form of, like, for instance, there was one the other day where the person, it was a foreign threat person. Just got to know a senior executive at a corporation through a social setting, started to understand things about their family, things about their, what they do, to learn what company they worked at, whether there was valuable information there to be had, find out and ultimately deduce passwords and connectivity into their corporate infrastructure just by getting to know that person. And we really have to all be aware and conscious about that. And back to your point on how should we be training employees? We need to make them aware that this stuff is really going on. That's not something just to a James Bond movie. It is happening day to day to people that you would never suspect.
And to the other point, just to build on Paul's points about, there's nothing valuable here to steal. The one thing we are seeing an increase of quite dramatically in manufacturing is not the financial theft. It's not taking dollars out of the bank accounts. It's stealing IP. It's stealing process technology. That's what other companies seem to be doing, especially state actors. So we're seeing a big increase in people. So the interest is plugging into the machine and finding out how it's set up and what materials they're using and all that sort of stuff is where there's a lot of that breach happening at the moment. So you may not imagine it to be, okay, can't happen here because it's not a financial problem, but that's just as valuable to a company out there that's trying to hack your system.
Why do you think we're seeing that uptick in data breaches that are related directly to IP theft? Why are we seeing state actors become more and more active in that space?
It's a very competitive world, especially as we move into the new technologies. So in the UK, we're making a big transition to net zero. There's lots of new technologies out there. We're seeing them being hit all the time with state actors trying to get the latest materials, what's happening there with the construction of wind turbines, all sorts of things happening, and the IP being extracted on that basis. So it's a lot of the new technologies, I think. They're not too interested in making orange buckets or something like that, but they're very interested in those sorts of new technologies.
Yeah.
And I would add that there's also, I don't want to put too much emphasis on state actors because that's the exciting kind of thing. There's also just a lot of dumb actors out there, okay? There are a lot of hackers that are just basically on the dark web. They're looking for anything. Some of the companies that they attack, they don't even know what the company does. They just, they find a vulnerability, they buy a way to penetrate that vulnerability off the dark web. They find something, they launch it, and then they realize, they may not even know the name of the company that they're infiltrating. And so there's such a gamut across the board that that's what makes it a difficult challenge.
I want to bring this back to the theme of the conference, which is trust and transparency. Stephen, when you and I spoke, we talked about some of the cyber attacks that have happened right here in the UK, and you were like, those are just the public ones. You're not even hearing about the ones that they aren't disclosing. And it made me think there are groups out there for various industries that actively share information and share their experiences about their attacks so that everyone else can learn from them. But that isn't necessarily the case in manufacturing, is it?
It's not the case generally, actually. We have a CERT system here, so the Cyber Emergency Response Team, where you can report cyber instances, but the amount of reporting that goes on is actually very, very small. And you touched on another problem there, that if you're a large company with a big brand, the last thing you want is your customers and shareholders to know that you have been hacked. So they keep these things very, very quiet. We get to hear about it because they're part of the community. Very often we have to anonymize that data if we're going to share it as a case study to try to help others. So there's a lot of sensitivity about admitting that you are in that situation. But it's useful information because we can then share best practice as to how you recover and how you avoid that happening in the future. So it's important.
I mean, how do you fix it? Do you lobby the government to force the companies to disclose these things?
Well, there's a fine line with lobbying the government about this issue because you end up with more regulation if you're not careful. So, and the companies don't tend to.
Double-edged sword.
So there is a fine line here, but most of it comes down to that human factor stuff, training your staff, training the team in the sites to understand what those threats are and to avoid it. And I think that's where the responsibility is not really for government, it's for companies to get on and do that.
Yeah, and to your point about like, is there something that the government can do? How do you lobby or whatever? There's, I think, a great case study of a situation where that has effectively worked is in the U.S. Just a year or two ago, the Colonial Pipeline hack that some of you may have heard about, basically shut down a huge oil pipeline in the U.S. that fed the whole eastern seaboard for
days,
like 5, 6, 7 days. And in that situation, that was a ransomware situation where they had to shut down operations simply because they didn't know what the hackers had and were afraid for the damage that they could do if they didn't pay the ransomware. And I think that after that happened, the industry was able to come together and really look at that exposure to a critical infrastructure of the United States to put new guidelines, new policies, new capabilities out there for companies to use and identify threat vectors that industry faces.
Paul has shared a few of the pretty egregious attacks that he's aware of in the U.S. I'd be interested in knowing what are some of the worst ones that you have seen in this region?
We had a very interesting one that struck me because it's fairly low tech. Was we had a really interesting business in the middle of the country, 600 employee type size business, pretty good size manufacturing business, injection molding, using the latest possible technology from Germany, so fully automated and with 600 staff, so a pretty big plant. And they were making storage containers and pretty basic sort of household stuff, but they were competing with a very strong Chinese business, and they beat them, and they took all their business away in the UK, and they started to sell to the American market, and they're making great progress there. And they were pretty good. I mean, they were certified, everyone's trained, beautiful business, well capitalized. And it turned out their cybersecurity was not covering the IP
the irony.
in their main sheet. And they got in through the machine tool maintenance links on the internet that were not password protected, stole their process technology that was keeping them ahead. And surprisingly, a Chinese company started up using exactly the same processes, half the price, and they went out of business 6 months later. Oh. That was incredible to see that speed of degradation, because what was stolen was their USP. And that's the problem. It wasn't to do with dollars, it wasn't to do with the traditional ransomware attack. It was stealing the intellectual property out of the business, and then 6 months later, 600 people lost their jobs and it closed.
It's a powerful example of how one attack can destroy a business.
Absolutely.
Well, we've run out of time here, but I do want to thank our sponsors and I do want to thank our panelists for the really fascinating discussions. I also want to welcome everybody back to the main stage where we will be unveiling our annual UK Startups to Watch list. Thank you.